It was a perfect Tuesday morning, January 15th, 1974, in Wichita, Kansas, the kind of colorless winter day where the air was too still to carry sound, and the snow that had fallen overnight lay crisp and undisturbed on the suburban lawns. This stillness, however, was about to be obliterated by a scream that ripped through the American understanding of safety, setting off a 30-year hunt for a phantom who lived among them. A church president, a family man, and the most calculated, narcissistic serial killer in the nation's history. The horror began with 15-year-old Charlie Otero. He returned to his modest home at 803 North Edgemore Street, a tidy bungalow in an ordinary neighborhood. Charlie was already late for school, having stayed overnight at his grandfather's house. He pushed open the front door, and the sight that greeted him instantly curdled the mundane reality of his suburban life. His younger brother, 10-year-old Joey, was sprawled face down near the living room door, motionless. The house was frigid, the air thick with a coppery, metallic smell Charlie instantly knew was blood. Charlie didn't enter fully. He backed out slowly, his mind struggling to form a coherent thought around the impossible scene. He ran 2 blocks to a neighbor, choking out a fragmented account. Within minutes, the Wichita Police Department arrived and found a scene of methodical, personalized carnage that defied easy classification. The victims were the entire Otero family. Father Joseph, 38, Mother Julie, 34, daughter Josephine, 11, and the youngest, Joseph Jr., Joey, 10. They had been murdered not in a frenzy, but with chilling precision. They were all found bound, usually with materials brought by the perpetrator, and strangled or smothered. Joseph Otero was found in the bedroom, a knotted cord around his neck. Julie Otero was in a separate room, bound and strangled. The children were killed in yet other locations. The meticulous binding, the separation of the victims, and the sheer calculated nature of the multi-murder immediately signaled that this was not a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. It was a cold, deliberate exercise in control. In the ensuing weeks, investigators struggled. There were no witnesses, no signs of forced entry, and no immediate suspects. The killer had vanished as cleanly as the winter snow had fallen, leaving behind only the profound, agonizing silence of a wiped-out family. The community of Wichita, a quiet, conservative city that felt far removed from the urban nightmares of New York or Los Angeles, was paralyzed by a fear that had no face. The murderer had introduced a new lexicon of terror: bind, torture, kill. The Otero murders could have been a gruesome anomaly, a one-off tragedy, but the killer had a deep-seated, desperate need for recognition, a need that outweighed his desire for self-preservation. He wanted credit for his work. In October 1974, 9 months after the Otero tragedy, a bizarre letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle newspaper. It was a rambling, narcissistic manifesto peppered with psychological jargon and self-aggrandizing claims. The author stated that he had murdered the Otero family. More chillingly, he proposed a name for himself based on his preferred method: BTK. He wrote of his struggle between his Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde sides and confessed that his obsession was driven by a need to bind them, torture them, and finally kill them, to satisfy a creature he called Factor X.
The police had a choice: conceal the letter and potentially allow the killer to feel ignored, or release the information and warn the public. They released it. The monster had a name, and Wichita's fear intensified, curdling into mass hysteria. BTK struck again shortly after announcing himself. On April 4, 1974, just 3 months after the Oteros, 21-year-old Catherine Bright was murdered, and her 19-year-old brother, Kevin, was severely wounded, surviving a gunshot to the head despite the medical odds. The crime scene mirrored the control seen at the Otero home. The victims were bound, but the method was evolving. This time, the killer used a knife and strangulation. Kevin Bright provided the first and only physical description of the killer: a man of medium height and build, who wore an aviator hat and carried a handgun. Despite this, the killer remained elusive. The early investigation was hampered by the era's technology, and a police force overwhelmed by a new type of criminal. Profiling was still nascent, and DNA analysis was decades away from becoming standard forensic practice. Investigators, notably Detective Jim Wright, began to see a pattern beyond the physical violence. BTK was intensely focused on control, staging the victims, and enjoying the process of preparation more than the act itself. In March 1977, BTK murdered 25-year-old Shirley Vian in her home. She had been bound and gagged with unusual knots, a detail that spoke to the killer's meticulous preparation. And then, in December 1977, Nancy Fox, 25, was murdered in her home. After this killing, BTK, craving the connection and control, used Nancy's own phone to report the murder. This moment marked a critical escalation, showing BTK's audacity and his desire to be an active participant in the police response. The early murders, though spanning only 3 years, cemented BTK's reign of terror. He was smart, methodical, and invisible. He was not a drifter or an outsider. He was someone who knew the neighborhoods, who could blend in, and who had the terrifying ability to be patient. After the murder of Nancy Fox in 1977, the city breathed a temporary sigh of relief as the letters and the killings stopped. The years stretched into decades. The case went cold, but the psychological scar on Wichita remained, a low-grade fever of anxiety that never fully broke. Meanwhile, the man the entire country was searching for settled into a life of unremarkable, almost aggressively normal routine. His name was Dennis Lynn Rader. Rader had been raised in Wichita, served in the Air Force from 1966 to 1970, and worked for ADT Security Services, a job that ironically gave him detailed knowledge of home security systems and access to blueprints of suburban homes. In 1971, he married Paula Dietz. He was a father, a husband, and a seemingly devoted member of the Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, a small town just north of Wichita. He rose to the position of church council president. His public life was a masterpiece of camouflage. A compliance officer for Park City, a strict dog catcher who would occasionally harass his neighbors over minor code violations, and a seemingly upstanding pillar of his community. Rader cultivated an image of rigid authoritarianism and petty officialdom. This control extended to his home life, where he was known for being demanding but never violent. No one, not his wife, not his children, not his pastor, had the slightest hint of the dark, violent fantasy life he meticulously constructed in secret. This long interregnum was marked by sporadic, calculated reappearances, fueling the investigation led by the tireless Detective Jim Wright, and later a new generation of investigators like Kelly Otis and Sheriff Lieutenant Ken Landwehr. BTK resurfaced in 1985 to claim 2 more victims. Vicki Wagerly, 28, murdered in September 1986, and Dolores Davis, 62, murdered in January 1991. These killings followed the established pattern: binding, control, and staging. But following the Davis murder, BTK fell silent again for 13 long years. The case became a legend, a ghost haunting the files of the WPD, revived only through segments on America's Most Wanted and cold case documentaries. The police, however, were not idle. Advances in DNA technology meant that even though the case was cold, the evidence, small samples of semen left at several crime scenes, was preserved and continually reanalyzed. The DNA profile became the Phantom's digital fingerprint, the key they knew they would eventually use. The investigators understood that BTK's ego was his greatest weakness. They waited, knowing his need for recognition would compel him to break his silence. The waiting game finally broke in 2004. As the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders approached, BTK, now in his late 50s, became obsessed with ensuring his legacy was not forgotten. The modern era had provided him with a new way to communicate: the internet and digital media. In March 2004, BTK broke his long silence. A letter arrived at a Wichita TV station, Cake, containing photocopied pictures of Vicki Wagerly's 1986 crime scene and a driver's license that had been stolen from the Davis home in 1991. This reemergence was a thrilling, terrifying moment for investigators. The game was back on. Over the next year, BTK became increasingly bold, sending a series of packages to news outlets and police. He taunted the police about the preservation of DNA evidence, indicating he was closely following the case. His communications grew into a stream of coded messages, crude poetry, and increasingly specific details about the murders. The breakthrough came with a daring, narcissistic proposal from BTK himself. In one communication, he asked the police via email, was it possible to communicate with them via a floppy disk without being traced? He wanted to know if they could track an electronic message. The police, spearheaded by Lieutenant Landwehr, responded publicly via a small notice in the Wichita Eagle, assuring the killer that it was safe to send the disk. Knowing this appeal to his ego and desire for technical superiority would be irresistible. In February 2005, BTK sent the promised floppy disk to a Wichita TV station, concealed within a cereal box. This was the moment his 30 years of meticulously constructed anonymity crumbled. The disk was a 1.44 megabyte Memorex floppy disk, and it contained a single Microsoft Word document. The document was an edited version of the draft book BTK planned to write about his life. While the file content contained nothing of value, just another narcissistic screed, the metadata was a goldmine. Sometimes wearing disguises or even taking small items as trophies.
Rader revealed his compulsion, which he referred to as his Project BTK. It was his secret hobby, his way of achieving ultimate control in a life he perceived as mundane. He explained his methods, the knots, the staging, and the sexual gratification he derived purely from the terror of his victims. He confessed that when the murders stopped in 1991, it wasn't due to guilt or fear, but because his job as a compliance officer gave him enough power and control over people's lives to satisfy his Factor X for a time. He was, in his own mind, a god in his small corner of the world. The most shocking revelation was the sheer audacity of his double life. He spoke of attending church and teaching Sunday school the day after a murder. He recalled writing the 1974 letter while working at a security company office. The monster, the pillar of the community, and the petty code enforcer were all contained within the same man, seamlessly compartmentalized. The news of Dennis Rader's arrest, the man who was everyone's neighbor, the dog catcher, the church leader, sent shockwaves across America. The sheer hypocrisy and longevity of the deception were astonishing. The lead-up to the trial in summer 2005 was a spectacle. Rader, representing himself for a time, continued his narcissistic quest for control, reading aloud in court the chilling technical descriptions of how he stalked, bound, and murdered each victim. He spoke in a flat, dispassionate monotone, describing the killings not as acts of profound evil, but as exercises in control. In June 2005, Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. The defense team, seeking to spare his family the public humiliation of a prolonged trial, allowed Rader to enter the plea, but they could not stop his need to confess. His courtroom narrative, complete with drawings and technical details of the knots and methods he used, lasted nearly an hour and remains one of the most chilling, unfeeling confessions in criminal history. Because the last of the 10 murders occurred before the 1994 Kansas law allowing the death penalty, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, totaling 175 years. The lasting impact of the BTK saga extends far beyond Rader's incarceration at the El Dorado Correctional Facility. For the city of Wichita, Rader's arrest finally allowed the decades of ambient fear to coalesce into a concrete image of betrayal. The realization that the monster had not been an anonymous drifter, but a self-appointed authority figure living down the street, fundamentally altered the trust dynamic in suburban America. It became the defining case of the hidden, meticulous evil that thrives not in the shadows of the city, but in the glaring light of the ordinary neighborhood. For the victims' families, Rader's confession provided excruciating detail, but no relief. Charlie Otero, the teenager who first discovered the horror in 1974, spent the rest of his life processing the trauma, eventually finding a fragile sense of peace after Rader's capture. The capture itself validated the 30 decades of work by the detectives who refused to close the file, particularly the quiet brilliance of using digital forensics to leverage the killer's ego against him. Dennis Rader, the man who craved infamy, now lives out his life in isolation, his name permanently etched into the darkest corner of American true crime lore. The BTK case's factual details, the ADT job, the church presidency, the specific details of the credit mobilier scam, a false comparison removed to maintain factual accuracy for Rader's life, which involved the church council and code enforcement, the use of the floppy disk's metadata, and the familial DNA confirmation are what make the story so astonishing. It wasn't raw police work that caught him in the end, it was his own hubris, his need to break the rules, and the fact that even a man dedicated to living a double life could not escape the immutable laws of digital physics. The silence that fell over Wichita after his capture was not the sound of fear, but of an awful, final recognition. The terrifying truth was often the most ordinary face in the crowd.